Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. My name is Travis Fortney. I'm an adult services librarian at the Willoughby Public Library. We're coming to you live from downtown Willoughby in Lake County, Ohio. Tonight, we're going to talk to Christina Baker Kline about her new book, The Exiles. Before we get started, I want to tell you about a few upcoming programs in our Between the Lines series. Coming next week, we have mystery author D.M. Pulley. In October, we have Pete Betty, who will talk to us about his debut novel, Cuyahoga, and Elise Goldbach, who will talk to us about her memoir, Rust, a memoir of steel and grit. In November, we'll be visited by another #1 New York Times bestseller, but the details aren't quite worked out yet, so you have to stay tuned for that one. Tonight, I'm extremely excited to welcome Christina Baker Kline to Between the Lines. Christina is the #1 New York Times best-selling author of 8 novels, including The Exiles, Orphan Train, and A Piece of This World. Christina's books have been published in 40 countries. She's won prizes such as the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, and a Barnes & Noble Discover Award. Her books have been chosen by hundreds of communities as one book, one read titles, similar to Lake County a couple years ago. And Exiles was an instant New York Times bestseller. If you have a question for Christina during the program and you're watching on Zoom, type it into the chat. We'll be monitoring it and we'll ask Christina your question. If you're watching on Facebook Live, type your question as a comment there. Christina, can we start tonight by having you tell us a little bit about The Exiles and maybe read a short portion of the book?
Sure. Hi, how are you? It's great to see you. Can I do this so I can just see? There we are. Perfect. I'm looking at you. Is everyone looking at me? I can't tell.
Yeah, so we're definitely good. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't have it in full screen there.
I can only see you. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so yeah, happy to be here. The Exiles is the story of the convict women who transformed Australia. This is sort of the macro picture, and the Aboriginal people whose way of life was destroyed when colonists landed on their shores. But my novel is actually about essentially 3 women, 2 women who have come over on the convict ships, and one who's an Aboriginal girl.
Cool.
Yeah.
Were you going to read a little bit?
Sure, I will do that. Yeah. Okay. So I'm confused because I'm not seeing anybody but you. Is that normal that you're anyway?
Well, let me.
Oh, it's
yes.
great.
Yes,
I
it
think
is.
it's the way you're looking at the screen. I think.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
Real quick.
We've turned off the video for all the participants.
Got it. Okay, great. Okay, so.
Oh yeah, we're good. I just checked.
Okay, I'm gonna just read 1 minute. This is just a section where my character, who's a governess, is she's on her way to Newgate Prison. She's been falsely accused of a crime. She's not used to being, sort of in this position where she's treated terribly, and it's just beginning to sink in that this sort of terrible thing has happened to her. Okay. So now, sitting in the drafty carriage, Evangeline moved her shackled wrists to the left side of her body and rubbed the place beneath her petticoat where she tucked the monogrammed handkerchief. With the fingers of one hand, she traced its faint outline, imagining she could feel the thread of Cecil's initials intertwined with the family crest, a lion, serpent, and crown. It was all she would ever have of him, except apparently for the child growing inside her. The carriage made its way west toward the river. No one spoke in the chilly compartment. Without realizing what she was doing, Evangeline inched closer to the solid warmth of the constable next to her. Glancing down, he curled his lip and shifted toward the window, widening the space between them. Evangeline felt a prickle of shock. She had never in her life experienced a man's revulsion. She'd taken for granted the small gifts of kindness and solicitude that came her way, the butcher who gave her choice cuts of meat, the baker who saved her the last loaf. Slowly it dawned on her. She was about to learn what it was like to be contemptible.
Yeah, so that's that's the character Evangeline who seems to have a lot of advantages going for at the beginning of the story. We were talking about this right before we came on. Who like the contemporary reader might relate to, who's bookish and smart and pretty, comes from a stable home, has kindness going for her. But I guess her flaw is her innocence, maybe, or maybe she's read too many books and she's a bit of a romantic. I'm wondering what her, and basically without giving anything away in the story, none of that amounts to any good it doesn't do Evangeline any good. So I'm wondering what her story says about the era you're writing in. And do you think the world has improved much for women since the 1840s? And how would Evangeline fare today?
Oh, that's interesting. So Evangeline opens the novel. She's sort of a stand-in for the reader. She herself is a reader. She's a thoughtful person. She notices the world around her, but she doesn't have much experience in the world. So she gets thrust into this position and going to the prison and ending up on a convict ship. And she has no frame of reference for it. So for me, she was sort of a guide into the story, into this very foreign world that she didn't know anything about. And the reader really experiences it through her eyes. So I wanted to begin the story that way because the world is so strange and different. It takes place in the 1840s. As I said, it begins in London. We have a flashback to her village, which is Tunbridge Wells outside of London. And then she ends up, as I said, in prison and then going to Australia. And it's a whole different world. But the people that she's with, most of them have experienced that world before. So Hazel is this scrappy, street smart kind of urchin whose mother was a midwife, and she sort of takes over the story at a certain point because she has this superpower. She is able to heal people and to use her powers, her knowledge of herbs and flowers and ways of healing, both for good and ill, I guess I would say. And that skill is very helpful to her and to other people as the story progresses. And then there's this Aboriginal girl, Mathina, who is based on a real person. And she's this beautiful daughter of a chieftain who did a dance in front of these British colonial lord and lady and their staff, all these people. And they decided on a whim to take her in. She's been orphaned, and see if they can turn her into a British lady. So they dress her in silks and teach her how to do English dances and teach her French. And so her life is now at the governor's house, but she's essentially treated like a curiosity.
Yeah, I somehow didn't catch that she was based on a real person, but the way she's written, I thought she must be. I'm curious, are the Lord and Lady, are they based on real people too, or?
Yeah, there are about a half a dozen, maybe more, people in the book who were real figures. So you might be interested to know. I don't know if you ever saw. I know we were talking about Game of Thrones earlier before we went live, but I don't know if you ever saw a show called The Terror that was a mini series last year. It was about this man who existed in real life, Sir John Franklin, who was an Arctic explorer and very famous because his boat was called the Terror, and he disappeared in the Arctic with 2 full boats of crew and was never seen again. And that was in the mid 19th century. So this was what he really did, which was he went to become governor of this Australian state. And he took in this girl, Mathina, with his wife, Lady Jane. They were all real people. And in real life, John Franklin, who was the governor and eventually, as I said, simply took off to the Arctic, was rewarded for all of these very dodgy excursions he took. At one point, there were hints of cannibalism. He had many failed expeditions, but then he was knighted. His wife was a big advocate for him, and she advocated for him in the London courts and in the court of the king and of Queen Victoria. And so their story is very interesting. It's not the focus of my book, but all of that kind of underlies the book because he was such a ridiculous figure in my mind in some ways.
Yeah, the Lady Jane character in the book, she's a fairly minor character, but I was wondering if you see any of her, and she reminded me of, a person, like people today who might, I can't think of an example, but who might undertake things and intend to do good and think they're doing good and really not be. I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but I was wondering if you saw any, contemporary connection to what she does in the book, which is kind of take on Martina as a curiosity.
Sure.
She's not, you don't end up liking her very much in the book, but I mean, thought.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I thought I could see that happening, and I could see someone doing what she does and thinking the whole time that they have she maybe thinks she has Martina's best interests at heart, or she's, really doing her a favor. She's really helping her. And of course, she, helps to destroy her.
When I wrote this novel over the past few years, I was very much thinking about what was going on in the world, and there's a lot of turmoil in the world, and there are a lot of parallels with the 19th century, and our American history is not, in some ways, all that different from Australia's, in that America, too, sort of began as a penal colony. 50,000 British soldiers were sent here before we declared our independence and eventually won the war. And then England decided that they would have to send their prisoners somewhere else. They considered the coast of Africa, but it was too rocky, and they couldn't find a port that made sense for a large population of prisoners to come in. And so they chose Australia because it was essentially uncharted territory, and the French had been there, the Dutch had been there, but the British were the ones who really came in and colonized, who shoved the Aboriginal people off their land, who took over, as they had done, as the British do everywhere they go, or did when they were an empire, at least. And, as someone who's myself, not only am I descended from British people, but I have dual citizenship because I was born in England and lived there for a number of years. So I feel quite solid in my critique of British culture, the British Empire in particular. But yeah, so that attitude where you sort of act like you're doing this sort of noblesse oblige, you're doing this favor, but you're actually just amusing yourself and making yourself feel better is exactly what I was getting at with that character. And that's what happened to Martina, that she was very much caught between worlds and was paraded out to make a point, not because Lady Jane really cared about her. And I think that's as true in real life as it was in my novel.
What led you to write a novel about Australia? Is it connected to your British or your English upbringing, I guess? Or
yeah, I mean, in part it is, but when you write a novel, I don't know, do you write fiction at all?
I've dabbled.
Yeah. Well, in my experience, either you sort of, an idea comes to you in pieces and you sort of cobble it together like a magpie. Things appeal to you and you sort of pull them together and come up with an idea, or it's more like a thunderbolt that you come across something and it strikes you immediately that it could be a really interesting avenue. And I've learned that those ideas, and I call it a kind of spidey sense, that tingle I get, are the really good ones. And they're often things that scare me that I'm not sure I can do. But the truth is that I also often don't know exactly why I'm drawn to something until much later. And so I stumbled on an article in the New York Times about the convict women, and it was women and children. And I immediately knew it was an interesting story. I was already working on another book, so I put it aside, but I kept thinking about it. But I didn't know until I'd finished the book that there were all these elements from my own life that kind of came together to make me interested in it. One is that I went to Australia in my 20s as a Rotary Fellow for 6 weeks, and I was kind of obsessed with it. I had read The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes, this amazing book. And so that was part of that. Another is that I wrote a book on feminism and interviewed all these women with my mother. We interviewed 60 women, and I got a lot of experience sort of telling women's stories. And I thought of how women have been left out of history a lot of times because they haven't been the ones to tell it. I taught in a women's prison and became really interested in the criminal justice sort of reform, and also what it means to be incarcerated. And then, having grown up in England too, all of those things, I think, led me to this story in a way that might not have appealed to someone else directly.
I'm interested in particular in the time teaching in a women's prison. I mean, I think this story really, this book really reads like the person who wrote it knows what it's like to just be out of luck. And
yeah.
so I think I was thinking maybe you learned that from some of those stories of of talking to women prisoners, I guess. And I was wondering if you could talk about how you got into that, what it was like,
Yeah. I'd been teaching for years, and I was teaching at the college level. And I felt that I wanted to see about teaching people who haven't had the opportunities that my students had to express themselves. And it occurred to me that women in prison might not have had the chance to tell the stories of their lives and and to write about their own experience. And it was true, a lot of them had never done that before. So I applied to teach to the only all-female prison in the state of New Jersey. It's called the Clinton Correctional Facility, the Edna Mahan facility in Clinton, New Jersey. And I just had an incredible experience, because part of what I learned was that you can make a life anywhere. I mean, that people do, that the impulse to connect and to have friends and to exist in a meaningful way is true no matter where you are and what the conditions are. So that guided me as I was writing this novel, in particular about the experience of being in prison and being deprived, being in solitary confinement, for example, and really having to survive by your wits and find allies.
Cool. So I read that, taking it in a random direction, I read that you're a fan of the Little House books. Is that true?
Yeah.
So like the Exiles and Orphan Train, those novels tell a settler story. Now, what is it that interests you about the concept of settling? And how is the Exiles different from the pioneer narratives you grew up hearing? Do you think of it as a pioneer story?
It is a pioneer story. Sure, these women were pioneers, brought against their will to a land like our situation with pioneers in America. As I mentioned, the Aboriginal people were displaced from their hunting grounds. The British built fences around all of these, what they called fields, but what had just been rolling farmland, essentially, or land. And they cultivated it, and they put sheep on this land. And then these people came in and forged a life there and built a sort of mini British society. with Western style houses and all of that stuff. And our westward expansion had some similar traits. There was a very individualistic streak among people who populated Australia. They didn't want a ton of regulation. They wanted to make their own decisions about things. They wanted to take the land that they, that they saw. But also that life was really hard. And part of what I liked about the Little House books is that Laura Ingalls Wilder really wrote about what it was like to survive brutal conditions without many amenities at all, how to build a life out of nothing. And I think I've been drawn to those kinds of stories for sure.
Something that I was thinking about as I was reading this book, which it's almost as out there as Game of Thrones, I guess, but I thought of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. And what I thought is that this book, The Exiles, is set in the 1840s Australia. But what the characters face is basically a world in which young women, particularly pregnant women, can be shipped off to prison, on trumped up charges, basically to populate a distant colony. And that's basically every bit as horrifying as something that, is what you would find in, as speculative fiction, a kind of, and I'm wondering if you think that historical fiction packs more punch than speculative fiction as a cautionary tale because it really happened. I mean, is that what is the truth of it? What draws you to, writing historical fiction?
Margaret Atwood said that nothing in The Handmaid's Tale was made up. All of it is taken from history and from even current day stories. It's just that she pulled it all together into one story, basically. And I would say that I thought of this story as a kind of dystopian story. It's hard to believe that some of this stuff happened. I mean, so as I mentioned, when America declared independence, Britain looked around and chose Australia as a place to dump their prisoners, but they really didn't think it through because they dumped male prisoners there. And by 1803, Australia was 9-1 men to women. So the British government devised a secret plan, basically, to sweep women off the streets and send them over under the flimsiest of pretenses to be breeders and to populate Australia. And they did. They populated Australia. 20% of Australians are descended from convicts even today. So
yeah, it's pretty amazing. Wild.
It's kind of an amazing story. Yeah.
I was wondering if, I really like, I don't know if this is even a thing really, but I really like Australian movies. When you find an Australian movie on Netflix, it tends to be reliably dark and unhinged, yeah. I think. But, like The Proposition, the Babadook, I mean, that's just Animal Kingdom, Sweet Country.
Right.
These are all messed up movies. And I'm wondering if, there's anything you see in particular about the Australian point of view that makes for, good drama, I guess, or good fiction, good art. And I'm wondering if there are any, in the course of researching this book, any Australian literature, movies, that you came across that you basically want to recommend to the audience, I guess.
I mean, sure. Australia is so interesting because they had essentially they were established as a penal colony, right? And then there was a lot of shame about that, but there was also this renegade sensibility that that they were open, they could do it, that people could do anything, that again, that they didn't want to be regulated too much, that they survived by their wits. And eventually there was a lot of pride about being descended from convicts. But for a while, when everyone was concerned about assimilation, there was what was called the convict stain, which is this great source of shame that people would hide their pasts about. And I think that some of that weirdness that you're describing comes out of that, that sense of being kind of exiled, as I say in my book, exiled to this place and starting over and building a society from scratch. And there are good and bad things about doing that. But I think the Australian sensibility is very individualistic, and the movies are really interesting for that reason. So, I mean, there are so many, but Rabbit Proof Fence is one that has to do with Aboriginal people. There's a new movie called The Nightingale, which is actually about the convict women. And it was made by the same team that is going to adapt The Exiles for television. I recommend it. It's much darker than my book, actually. It takes place 20 years earlier, but it's a similar story of convict people and Aboriginal people. And Picnic at Hanging Rock is one that I loved many years ago. Again, that weirdness, that strange sensibility. There was a podcast I listened to last year that was about a murder in, a disappeared woman in Sydney, that clearly she was murdered. But all of those elements that you described, those strange kind of conclusions people draw, and the angle, the way that people come at it, it does feel very Australian.
So you mentioned that the Exiles has been optioned for TV. Bruna, I'm going to butcher the name here, but Bruna Papandrea, the producer of Wild, Gone Girl, and Big Little Lies, has picked up the option, and you're an executive producer on the project. Yeah. I'm wondering, how involved in the project do you see yourself being? Are you excited about it, I guess?
Yeah.
Are you going to be, do you see yourself? I think a lot of writers, maybe want to take a step back from that or not be involved at all. I'm just curious, do you see yourself having creative control over it? And
right. I definitely, I won't have creative control, but I definitely want to be involved. And I think that among the people I know writing right now, most people do welcome being involved, because it feels like there's more fluidity than ever between film, television and novels, or even and nonfiction. I was talking to Eric, and I was just looking at his book, Eric Larson, last night about his own film. I think that a lot of novelists are writing for television, and sort of, as I said, welcome the chance to get involved and have some say. This team, the team that's optioned The Exiles, is this all-female team. They're half Australian, half in LA. So they're in Sydney and LA. And that, it just feels like the perfect group to do this novel. And they seem to move forward quickly. So I'm really excited, and I hope that this will happen in the next while. It's a little hard with COVID, of course, but
I imagine, I don't know, social distancing and mask wearing on set might not make for good drama, I guess. Good TV.
I know.
We have an audience question. I'll throw it in, and then and remind the audience that if they want to ask questions, feel free to type it in the chat. We're monitoring it. Which of your novels is your favorite, and which is your favorite novel that you didn't write?
Well, my favorite novel that I didn't write is my next novel that I will write. I don't have a favorite that I didn't write otherwise, I guess. My new novel is always my favorite, because it's the one that I do think I get better with each novel, just because I learn more with each one. I don't know if you look at them all in a row, if someone else would decide that, but it feels that way to me because I set myself new goals for each book. So The Exiles is definitely my favorite at the moment. It has so much drama. It was such an exciting book to write. There are so many moving parts in it, but I think it's fairly easy to follow. So I learned a lot writing it. I think people will, learn a lot reading it. So yeah, for sure.
It's a great, I'll just say that I really enjoyed reading it, and it's a great, you feel like you're learning something new, and it's also as fast moving as a movie, and a lot, and a fun read. And it has some great surprises thrown in there too. We were talking before we started here about a plot twist that comes in the middle of the book. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, about how you make a big decision like that as a writer, and where in the writing process that came, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, if you've read my books, I often have some surprising thing that people are outraged about, or that shocks them. It's true in my last two novels. I kind of want to catch people off guard. I don't want to write a book that feels predictable. But more than that, I wanted to show that these convict women's lives are unpredictable entirely, that they have no control, at least for a certain amount of time. They have no control over what happens to them. So they have to wrest control away from other people, but that's a complicated and hard process, and it doesn't always work. And so my feeling as I was writing this book was I wanted to establish something. But because of the way my characters develop, it felt absolutely natural to me, and I had the idea from the very beginning that there would be sort of a plot twist part of the way through the book. And I'm trying to think about how to talk about it without giving it away. But
no spoilers.
But I envisioned the book as I think I said this to you earlier before we got on, but as a relay race, that one character essentially passes the baton to another, and then another. And she passes on all these things as she does that. She passes on literacy, and she passes on love of a particular play, The Tempest, and some literal objects, some concepts, some ideas that get threaded through the book. So when I was structuring the book and planning it, that was already what I was kind of working on. I knew that the narrative would proceed in a certain way, and it was really exciting to write it.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that, about the use of the Tempest in the book.
Yeah,
I was just wondering what the reasoning behind that was. A lot of basically, a series of characters all take a lot of comfort from the Tempest. They pass the physical book around. Why that choice?
Well, The Tempest was such an obvious choice because it's about a shipwreck on an island, and all of this sort of fantastical stuff happens. And it was unnatural that my character would have seen it performed, on a village green when she was growing up, and because it was everywhere in the 1830s and 40s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. And then that another character in Glasgow might have seen it as well. And, Shakespeare still is, but at the time, Shakespeare was even bigger in that people memorized the plays and, studied them intensely. And it was sort of in England, at least, those plays were a form of education, just all of them. So I had grown up seeing The Tempest, and it resonated for me, and I was able to thread different aspects of going to this island that's unknown, Van Diemen's Land, and exploring it and storm tossed, and surprising things happen and reversals happen. So it was just a natural. It felt when I sort of came to that, I realized this is the perfect kind of analogy for me.
I have one more question about a reference in the book, which you might have a similar answer for it. So if you do, you can just make the answer short. But I was interested in the name of the ship that carries Evangeline to Australia. It's named the Medea.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering about the ways the Medea myth plays into your story. Also, is there a specific is there anything specific you had in mind there, basically?
I just was writing about women and rage and betrayal and agency, and Medea just seemed like the perfect name for that ship, filled with women, all of whom have had a rough time of it, most of whom have ended up there for the stupidest of reasons, stealing a silver spoon, literally a loaf of bread. Their lives were so unvalued and undervalued that they really had no recourse. They were thrown together. They had to figure out how to make it work. And the Medea seemed like a great sort of, the idea of this ship full of angry women. I just loved that.
Yeah, that's perfect. Another audience question, which I feel like we must have covered, but maybe we didn't. Maybe I skipped right over it. But could you talk a little bit about the research that went into writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, in the end of the book, I have a whole acknowledgments where I talk about what led me to it and all the stuff I did. I mean, my feeling is that research is really important, and I did a ton of research for the book, but really it's the story that matters. So the research has to be in service to the story and not the other way around. I don't like reading novels where I feel like the writer's trying to teach me something or show me how much research they did. So as I was editing the book, I had to be really ruthless about just cutting back everything that wasn't directly relevant to the story. So if my character didn't see it, taste it, touch it, feel it, it was gone from the book. So yeah, I did a ton of research. I went to Australia twice and spent a lot of time in the prison that still exists and is now a museum, and in related prison sites and museums and homes, manor homes that are now open to the public. And also just existing there and sort of feeling what it was like in Tasmania, which used to be called Van Diemen's Land at the time the women were there, interviewing this historian who was super helpful to me, and just immersing myself. I love the research. My dad is a historian, so it comes naturally to me to want to do that. And it's, in some ways, it's the best part of the process because it's just so fascinating. And a lot of ideas for plot points emerge out of the research, of course, as you're doing it. You can't plan it all in advance. You have to really be open to what you find.
Yeah, as a reader, it feels like we landed right there and we're right in the middle of the story, but it also feels like you must really know the story well. I mean, you must have spent a long time researching. That's how it reads to me, but very entertaining as well. So there you go.
Well,
good endorsement. So a few more technique kind of questions, I guess. One here is, do you have any advice to share with aspiring writers? Probably get asked that a lot, but
yeah. I do. On Instagram, I actually have I guess on Facebook too, I've just started doing Writing Wednesdays where I talk about sort of ideas, my tips and ideas, because I took over the HarperCollins page a couple of weeks ago on Instagram, and that was what people really wanted to talk about was, ideas and tips. So I'm at Baker Kline on Instagram, and I'm going to be doing it every Wednesday. I just did one. But yeah, I mean, the one that I just posted this week was about, it was really about kind of how I developed the discipline to get a novel, a first draft, finished, and the rules that I set for myself. So for an aspiring writer who wants to write a novel, I would say, don't give yourself a time amount that you have to work. Instead, give yourself a page, or a lot of people do word count. I mean, I write longhand, so my goal is 20 pages a week or 4 pages a day when I'm really working on a novel, because those add up. And I've learned not to make rules for myself about where to do it or how much time to spend. It's really about getting the pages out so that I have a first draft that I can work with. And also that at a certain point in every novel, you get to a moment where you feel that you've boxed yourself into a corner. And just knowing that that will always happen and that you have to write your way through it to get out of it. I describe it as Winnie the Pooh stuck in the hole, that he can't go forward, but he definitely can't go back. And you just have to sort of get tugged out of that hole. And there are all kinds of ways to do that. But just that it's a natural part of the process that you're going to feel that you can't move forward. And a lot of people abandon their novels about a third of the way in for that reason.
It's interesting. I've probably abandoned a lot of novels about a third of the way in myself.
Yeah,
So there
a lot of people do. A lot of people do.
I read that you're a parent of 3 sons. I was wondering how you balance writing with parenting, and if you got much writing done when your kids were young, just out of curiosity.
I was just doing an interview today where I was remembering that at one point I have 8 novels and 5 nonfiction books that I wrote or edited, but so I don't, I don't, it's not that I'm not prolific, but I have managed to do a book on average every 3 years. But there actually was an 8-year stretch when I didn't finish a novel. My children were young, I was teaching full time, and I just couldn't. But generally speaking, it's about 3 years between books. My kids are older now. My youngest is 20 and the other 2 are 24 and 25. So I am in a new phase where that's not the problem. But it's hard when you have young children. And I used to go and write in coffee shops. I don't really need to do that anymore. In fact, I like writing at home now, but for a long time, I couldn't do it unless I left the house. And I just had to get myself away from the children and do that.
Cool. We have a couple more audience questions that have rolled in. One is, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? And did you always want to be a writer?
Well, I always say that all children are born creative. I mean, when you have little kids, you see this, that all of them write as soon as they can. All of them draw and paint. They dance and sing. Like, all children do that. And most people outgrow it. And so I think a better question is, why didn't I outgrow it? Why did I keep going? Why do other people stop? And some of that has to do with encouragement. I think my parents were professors, but they were very encouraging of creativity in general, I guess. And part of it is, but that with that said, we didn't have a lot of money. So I had student loans. I always knew I was going to have to figure out a way to, if I was going to want to write and earn money. So I got qualified to teach at the college level, and I also became an editor. So I edited for many years as well. I just built a life that was centered around the idea of trying to write, but making money in other places. And some years I made enough money writing, not to, and other years I didn't. So having a job was really important, having jobs. And a lot of people don't want that uncertainty, which I really get. It is a really uncertain life, and there are a lot of ups and downs to it. So why did I persevere? I think I just knew from an early age that I wanted to live in the world of books, and that maybe there were different forms that could take. And I wrote a novel, and it got published, and it encouraged me to keep going. So, and then I would just say one other thing about that, which is that perhaps just by my nature, but I always say to my own children that when I had a choice between listening to someone who was telling me I wouldn't succeed or I couldn't do something, and listening to someone who encouraged me, I followed that person. In other words, I followed the yes. And that's a particular, that's a nice thing, which is that if you can drown out the people who are saying that, telling you all the negative things, and just follow that slender thread of someone telling you that you're good enough, that you can do it, that you have it in you, and listen to that voice. And it might not be your own voice, even it might be someone else's. That can be all it takes. That can make all the difference. There are many times that I could have stopped writing. And I tell my students as well, and that it often comes down to chance, or to someone taking a chance on you, or someone just bolstering you. Because it's a hard life to be a creative person. And no matter what, if you do it for a long time, you'll have ups and downs. So you're taking on a volatile way of life. But my background, just quickly, is that I was born in England. My parents are Southern, from North Carolina and Georgia. And I grew up going back and forth. And then eventually we moved to Maine. So I have these disparate parts of my past and personality. And I think that peripatetic nature, that quality, is something that has led me to write about a lot of different places.
Yeah, and you live in Maine now, and I think I read that all of your family, all your sisters or your brothers and sisters and parents live within a mile of you or something, or they all live nearby.
We all kind of settled in this little village. I live in New York City as well. My sisters live in New York and Washington, D.C. One lives here year round. So right now, since March, I've been here, which has been wonderful. And one of my kids is living in our apartment in New York, so he's doing just fine there. But it's hard to tell in this crazy moment where this will all end up. But right now we're here, and my sisters are all here too.
How are you faring during the pandemic, and are you getting much writing done?
I'm not getting much writing done. I'm researching my new novel, but I'm just, it's the weird thing about releasing a novel during the pandemic is that it's a lot of work, because everything is, as we're doing right now, where it's either events that are virtual, or it's a lot of social media stuff, a lot of interviews that are written. You don't have the in-person interactions. So there's kind of a lot for the writer to do. So I've been doing a ton of that sort of stuff. But over the next couple of months, as my novel's launched into the world, and I can sort of turn my attention back to the other stuff, to my work, my writing.
Do you do your own social media? I'm just curious.
It's hard. I do, and I have an assistant who came in right at the beginning of all of this stuff. Her name is Kat, and she is amazing. She's 24 and she knows a lot. She dragged me kicking and screaming onto Instagram, for example. And I've learned a ton from her. And she manages a lot. We just get that's the other thing, because it's all virtual, we get flooded with responses of all kinds, and questions and requests. And so she helps me with all of that. I don't think I could do it by myself. Either that, or I would just ignore a lot of it. But it's actually kind of lovely to interact with people on Instagram and Facebook, and Twitter to a certain extent, although that's the one that I feel is a deep, dark hole that I'll never emerge from if I, really jump in there.
Yeah, I think like I'm too old for Instagram, or I just don't get Instagram, but I don't know.
I mean, it is a very different thing. I think that I am definitely too old for certain parts of it. Like, I feel that Facebook is better suited to me because I like reading articles people recommend, and I like interacting in that way. The whole purely visual medium of Instagram is a little bewildering to me. I'm sort of bashful too. I don't really post pictures of myself very much, but I'm having to do that some. So it's just I just find it a funny medium. But I actually have also found lately, because Kat's sort of said, let's do this kind of post and that kind of, like, for example, I've been doing all these events with writers, and she posted she put together all their book covers in a post, and that was just really fun to see. And she sort of prodded me to do a video of talking about writing, and that was actually fun. But these are all distractions from writing, of course, but they're also part of the writing life at this moment. They're part of the writing and publishing world. So
Yeah.
I'm learning.
Yeah, you've had a really impressive run of like in conversation with it's been a who's who of the of I don't know books, I guess.
I think you're the first non-writer that I've done it with, actually. But it's been really fun. And
I feel distinguished. It's like me and John Grisham and all those Ann Patchett. I mean, you did one from Ann Patchett's bookstore, right? Like that's pretty cool.
She was amazing. What's been so fun about it is that each one it has a whole different feel, because the people have their own obsessions and their own interests, and it's been a real back and forth, which has been great.
So we have a couple more audience questions if you're game.
Yes, my husband brought me a glass of wine. So.
Oh, there you go. That's a surprising number of authors drink on these during these Zoom events.
I mean,
which is great because you can't really drink at a library. If
I know,
you're coming in the library, it's pretty much dry. So
I was feeling sorry for you. The most fun writer event that I went to before I started doing this was with Ruth Reichel, who's this incredible writer and chef, and Bill Buford, who has a new book out, who spent a year living in France and cooking and raising children there. And the two of them are old friends, and they were drinking red wine, and they were sitting in their kitchens, and their family were sort of wandering in and out, and they just looked like they were having the best time ever. And it was like we were eavesdropping on this really fun conversation between old friends. And I thought, that's what I want. That's what I want it to be like. If I'm going to do these events, I want it to be fun, and I want to have that relaxed sensibility, because I think it can be stiff. Zoom can be stiff, and you want it to feel to people like they've jumped into someone else's sort of interesting moment, or that they're overhearing a fun conversation. And so that was my goal when I set off to do these things.
So one audience question has to do with your novel Orphan Train, and the question is. Let's see here. The question is, what was your inspiration for writing the novel Orphan Train? But I'm interested in what it felt like to did you feel like you caught lightning in a bottle with that book, or did you? I mean, I don't know where you were exactly in your career before Orphan Train, but Orphan Train's a book that wasn't it #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 2 years or something, or off and on for 2 years, something like that, right?
Yeah, it was on the list for a really long time, and I think it was in the top 5 for a year or something. But it was like, now it seems inconceivable to me. That you're right, it was a crazy moment. I was a mid-list author. I had 4 novels. The most successful one had sold probably 35,000 copies at the time. And I thought that was great. As far as I was concerned, I had a life as a writer. I never aspired to have that happen. And it was such a shock to everyone, I think. It just, for whatever reason, caught the public imagination and took off. And I had stumbled on this little known story that my husband's grandfather had been orphaned and sent on a train with his siblings to this little town, Jamestown, North Dakota. And he was featured in an article on orphan train riders. And when I read the article, it was sort of what I was talking about, that I immediately knew this was an amazing story that I hadn't really read. And but it took me a while to write it, to come around to the idea of writing it, because it wasn't my story. So I wasn't sure I had a right to tell it. So I'm so glad that I eventually got up the courage to do it, because it then inspired me to take on other big projects, bigger in a way, eventually. But Orphan Train was a was a wild ride, and it continues to be. You know, if that's the book I'm remembered for, that's okay. But it definitely changed my life. But as I say, I would have kept writing. I would have kept writing and editing and teaching because I'm a writer and that's what I do. I'm not writing to be a bestseller. I'm not doing it for that reason. I'm doing it because it's what I love to do.
Sorry, I laughed at an audience question. And someone wants to know if we can meet your husband.
Dave, do you want to come in? He's laughing. My friend Emily is here and she knows him very well. Say hi. Okay, here he comes.
Hello, people.
Hello. That was fun.
And now we back away.
All right.
He knows I like rosé.
Cheers. What do you do to reduce stress during the pandemic? Do you run? Do you exercise? Yoga? Read?
That's a good question. What do you do?
I don't. I don't sleep. I can tell you that. I just stress all day. You know, it just gets worse and worse. I mean, I'm sorry, that's pretty dramatic, but I've got young kids, you know, and of course, I mean, you worry, you know. So.
Yeah, I know. It's stressful. It's incredibly stressful. I'm in Maine, in a county that has a total of 53 cases and 1 death since COVID began. And that's the entire county. So, which is really quite large. So here the fear is less, but it actually isn't, in that everyone wears masks pretty much.
Yeah.
People are very careful. We are very much in a cocoon of our own family. The one thing I do that is absolutely wonderful and lucky is that my sisters and I every morning hike this pretty much the same mountain every day. It takes about 45 minutes and we zip up and down. We've gotten so fast. And we gab the whole time. We leave the house at 7:15 or 7:30 every morning and are home by 8:15. And it's just the most amazing way to start the day. And I swear to you, I would not do it if it weren't for my sisters. And they pick me up, so I have to get out of my house and go. But it's a huge stress reliever. And that kind of extended family thing has been really nice. We're sort of quarantining. And to be honest, there are 4 of us and 2 of us see each other with our sort of families a little bit. And the other 2 see each other with their families, but the 4 sisters only see each other really. We're just trying to be, you know, not in bigger groups and things still.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. That sounds pretty nice. I shouldn't have been so dramatic in my answer.
No, but it's really hard. I mean, look, I can't imagine having young children right now. My 2 sisters do have young children that they're having to oversee schooling. And yours sound younger than that. I mean,
yeah, they're young, but I you know, yeah, I do relieve stress by gardening, and I, you know, look out at the lake, and it's not so bad.
Okay, now I don't feel so sorry for you. That sounds
so let's see. I think really just maybe 1 or 2 more questions. I'm interested in, you know, what you're working on next. Wait, before I ask another question, I forgot to tell everyone to buy the book. And I forgot to mention our book selling partner is Max Backs Books. Maybe Carol, if you're out there in the interwebs, you can put the Max Backs link to Christina's book in the chat and on the Facebook. And Max Backs has I forgot to mention this, but I got a signed ISBN from your publicist. So they have signed copies of the books to send out. So
oh yeah, great.
Everyone go to Max Backs and purchase the book. So I want to know what you're working on next, you know, what the book you're researching is, and this is the last question really, and what other, you know, contemporary books you're reading and would recommend to people watching tonight.
Okay, well, first I'll just say that I'm reading the new Elena Ferrante, which is amazing. I'm reading Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. And these are all the books by my co-presenters, and I've read, I've been reading all their books too. So I just read Courtney Sullivan's book, Friends and Strangers, and The Dutch House by Ann Patchett, because I did her this week. Writers and Lovers, Lily King. I actually blurbed that book, so I already read it. But that's been a joy, is reading all these incredible books by people I'm doing events with. Okay, my new novel that I'm working on now, I can't say all that much about it, except it's set in rural North Carolina at the time of the Civil War. And it's about two sisters and their relationship with two brothers whom they marry. And I'm gonna leave it at that, but it's another kind of disaster to take on the Civil War, because the people who know so much about it, know so much about it. I mean, Civil War buffs are crazed. They are so knowledgeable. I was actually talking to Eric Larson about this last night at our talk about Churchill, because he took on Churchill and was overwhelmed by how many Churchill scholars there are and how people know every last detail about Churchill's life. So I'm finding that a little bit with the Civil War, but I'm just
they all come to your readings and tell you what you're wrong about too.
They will definitely do that. That's no question. And this book, The Exiles, is being published in Australia and in the UK in October. And I'm sure I haven't been getting a lot of corrections. First of all, I worked really hard on not getting things wrong, but I suspect that when it's published in Australia, there will be plenty of people who have opinions about things I need to change.
Yeah, well, that's when you get into a argument in Australia about something, that's when you know you've really made it, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that I can aspire to that.
Well, Christina, that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you
very much for visiting with us tonight. Really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time, and you're going to come back and do the book club in a couple months, I think. So.
Yes, I'm going to pop into your book club. So anybody who is here who wants to be part of the book club, get the book and I will come and answer questions. You'll see me, like I'll see you on the screen, unlike tonight. So that'll be fun.
All right. Well, thank you. And thanks everyone for coming, and have a great night.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.